I used to do something that, looking back now, feels almost impossible to explain to the person I've become today. Back then, I spent a lot of time alone in the wilderness. Not the kind of hiking most people do on crowded trails with marked campsites and nearby roads. I mean, the kind of trips where you drive hours away from civilization, park at a forgotten trailhead, and walk until the world around you feels completely empty. No cell signal, no voices, no sign that anyone else has been there for days. At the time, it felt normal to me. I was in my mid-20s, years before I met my wife, and years before the responsibilities of adulthood started shaping how I thought about risk. Back then, I had the kind of freedom that makes you believe you're tougher than you actually are. The kind of freedom that lets you wander into places most people would never even consider going alone. Every few months, I'd pack my gear into my truck and disappear into the mountains for a few days. I always told people it was about the peace and quiet, and that was partly true. There's something about being deep in the woods that makes the noise of normal life fade away. No traffic, no phones, no conversations. Just the wind moving through the trees and the occasional sound of wildlife somewhere in the distance. Most of my friends thought the idea was insane. They would ask me why I didn't at least bring someone with me. A friend, a hiking partner, anyone. But the truth is, going alone was the whole point. When you're by yourself out there, every decision is yours. Every mile you walk, every place you stop, every risk you take, it's all on you. And for a long time, I loved that feeling. But there's a difference between solitude and isolation. And I didn't understand that difference until the trip that changed everything. This happened several years ago during one of my solo backpacking trips in the Appalachian Mountains. I had picked a section of forest that was known for being remote. The kind of place where you could hike for hours without seeing another person. That was exactly what I wanted. The first 2 days of the trip were perfect. The weather was clear, the trails were quiet, and the forest felt peaceful in that way only remote places can. I hadn't seen another hiker since the first morning when I passed an older guy heading in the opposite direction near the trailhead. After that, it was just me and the woods. I spent the first night camped near a narrow stream that cut through the trees like a silver ribbon. The sound of the water running over rocks made it easy to sleep. The second morning, I packed up early, shouldered my backpack, and continued deeper into the forest, planning to set up camp somewhere farther away from the main trail. By the afternoon of the second day, though, something started to change. At first, it was subtle. The sky began to darken in the distance, and the wind picked up just enough to make the treetops sway. I remember stopping on the trail and looking up through the canopy, watching the clouds slowly rolling in from the west. Storms in the mountains aren't unusual, and I had dealt with rain plenty of times before. Normally, it's just an inconvenience. You throw on a rain jacket, keep moving, and eventually the weather passes. But this storm felt different. Within an hour, the temperature dropped so quickly that I actually had to stop and pull an extra layer out of my pack. The wind started pushing through the forest in long, steady gusts that made the trees creak and groan. Then, the rain started. Not a light drizzle. A sudden, violent downpour that seemed to appear out of nowhere. Within minutes, the trail turned slick with mud, and the sound of rain hammering against the leaves overhead became almost deafening. I was already soaked before I even had time to react. Lightning cracked somewhere in the distance, followed by a deep roll of thunder that echoed through the mountains. Another flash lit up the forest for a split second, turning everything around me bright white before plunging it back into darkness. That was the moment I realized I needed shelter. Being caught in the rain is one thing. Being stuck on a mountain during a lightning storm with a metal-framed backpack is something else entirely. So I kept moving, scanning the forest on either side of the trail for anything that might provide cover. An overhang, a dense cluster of trees, even a fallen log, anything that might help block the worst of the storm. For a while, there was nothing. Just endless trees and sheets of rain pouring through the forest. And then, through the branches off to my left, I saw something that immediately made me stop in my tracks. At first, I thought it was just another tree trunk, dark and half hidden by the storm. But when the lightning flashed again, the brief burst of light revealed straight edges that didn't belong in the middle of the wilder. The rain was coming down so hard at that point that it almost felt like standing under a waterfall. Within seconds of stepping off the trail, mud was pulling at my boots, and wet branches were slapping against my arms and face as I pushed through the trees toward the cabin. From a distance, it had looked small. Up close, it looked even smaller. The structure couldn't have been more than a single room, maybe 10 or 12 feet across, with a low roof and weathered wooden walls that had clearly been standing there for a very long time. The wood had darkened with age and moisture, and parts of the roof looked like they had been repaired at some point decades ago. Still, it was shelter. And right then, that was all I cared about. I practically ran the last few steps to the door. The porch in front of it was barely more than a few wooden boards raised slightly above the ground. Water dripped from the edge of the roof in heavy streams, splashing against the muddy earth below. I grabbed the door handle and pushed. The door swung open easily. Inside, the cabin was dim and smelled damp, like old wood, and something else I couldn't quite identify at the time. But it was dry, and the moment I stepped inside and shut the door behind me, the sound of the storm outside dropped from deafening to distant. For the first time in nearly an hour, I could actually hear myself think. I stood there for a moment, just breathing, water dripping from my clothes onto the wooden floor. My jacket was completely soaked, and my backpack felt twice as heavy as it normally did. The room itself was almost empty. There was a small wooden table near one wall, a single chair that looked like it might collapse if anyone actually sat in it, and what appeared to be the frame of an old cot pushed into the corner. On the right side of the cabin there was a stone fireplace, though it was filled with old ash and debris that suggested it hadn't been used in a long time. It definitely wasn't comfortable, but compared to the storm outside, it felt like a luxury. I dropped my pack near the wall and peeled off my soaked jacket, wringing some of the water out of the sleeves before tossing it over the back of the chair. My shirt underneath was damp too, but not nearly as bad. At that point, my entire focus was on warming up and waiting out the weather. So I did what anyone would do in that situation. I picked a relatively dry patch of floor near the wall, leaned back against my pack, and let myself relax for the first time since the storm had started. The rain hammered against the roof above me with a steady roar. Every now and then, thunder rolled somewhere in the distance, shaking the walls just enough to remind me how intense the storm really was. For a while, I didn't do much of anything. I just sat there listening to the rain and catching my breath. Eventually, though, the adrenaline from the storm started to fade, and I found myself actually looking around the cabin more carefully. When I first ran inside, I had barely noticed anything besides the fact that it was dry. Now that my eyes had adjusted to the dim light coming through the single window, I started noticing details I hadn't paid attention to before. The place wasn't as empty as I had thought. In the far corner near the cot frame, there was a sleeping bag rolled up against the wall. That caught my attention immediately because, unlike everything else in the cabin, it didn't look ancient. It looked relatively new. Not brand new, but definitely not something that had been sitting there untouched for decades. That meant someone had been here. Maybe recently. I stood up and walked over for a closer look. The sleeping bag was dusty, but intact, the kind of thing someone might leave behind after using the cabin as a temporary camp. That alone wouldn't have been strange. People who hike deep into the mountains sometimes find old cabins like this and use them as shelters. Hunters do it too. It's not unusual for someone to leave supplies behind for the next person who passes through. But the more I looked around, the more things started to feel off. On the small table near the center of the room, there were a couple of empty cans and 2 large plastic water jugs. One of the jugs still had a little water left in it. That suggested the place had been used fairly recently. Yet the rest of the cabin looked far older than that. The walls were scratched and worn in ways that didn't look like normal damage from age or weather. At first, I assumed it was just rough wood grain catching the light strangely. But when I stepped closer to the door and shined my flashlight across the wall beside it, I realized that wasn't what I was looking at. They were scratches. Dozens of them. Some shallow, some deep enough that pieces of wood had splintered away from the wall. They didn't form any kind of pattern. They were scattered across the wood like someone had bee. For a moment, I tried to convince myself it wasn't a big deal. Old cabins in the mountains sometimes have strange repairs or modifications. Maybe whoever owned the place years ago just wanted a way to secure it when they weren't around. Maybe the inside latch had broken at some point, and someone had replaced it with that bracket outside. There were plenty of reasonable explanations. At least that's what I kept telling myself. Still, something about it didn't sit right with me. I stepped back from the door and slowly looked around the cabin again, this time paying closer attention to every detail. The dim gray light coming through the small window wasn't much help, so I clicked on my flashlight and swept the beam across the room. The scratches on the wall near the door looked even worse under the light. Some of them were shallow lines carved into the wood, but others were deeper, almost gouged out like someone had dug into the wall with something sharp or even with their fingernails. I tried imagining what could have caused that. An animal, maybe? But the cabin door had been shut when I found it, and the window glass was still intact. There weren't any holes big enough for wildlife to get in, which meant those scratches probably hadn't been made by an animal. I turned my attention toward the window. It was the only window in the cabin, set into the wall opposite the door. The glass looked surprisingly clean compared to everything else in the room. That alone caught my attention. Most abandoned buildings have broken or missing windows, but this one didn't. Curious, I walked over and leaned closer to examine the frame. That's when I noticed something that made my chest tighten again. There were screws drilled into the wooden frame, one in each corner of the window. At first I thought they were just part of the construction, but when I looked closer, it became obvious that wasn't the case. The screws had been driven in after the cabin was built. They pinned the window firmly into the frame so it couldn't be opened, and the screws had been driven in from the outside. I stared at them for a moment, trying to process what that meant. Then I noticed the scratches. More of them. These were around the edges of the window frame on the inside of the cabin. Unlike the scattered scratches near the door, these were concentrated in one area, right where someone would try to pry the window open. The marks were deep and uneven, as if someone had been desperately digging their fingers or some kind of tool into the wood trying to force the window loose. A cold feeling crept up my spine. I stepped back slowly, the beam of my flashlight drifting across the walls of the cabin as my mind started putting the pieces together. The door that could only be locked from the outside. The window that had been screwed shut from the outside. The scratches on the walls. The scratches around the window frame. All of it pointed toward a single explanation that I didn't want to accept. Someone had been trapped inside this cabin. Not accidentally, deliberately. I stood there in the middle of the room, the sound of rain pounding against the roof above me, trying to convince myself that whatever had happened here must have taken place a long time ago. The cabin looked old. The scratches looked old. Everything about the place suggested years of neglect. Even the sleeping bag in the corner, which had seemed relatively new at first, was stiff with dust when I nudged it with my boot. Whatever had happened here, it was probably in the past. That was the logic I held on to, because the alternative was something I didn't want to think about. And besides, the storm outside was still raging. Lightning flashed through the window, followed by another crash of thunder that rattled the walls. The rain was coming down just as hard as before, maybe even harder. Going back out into that would have been miserable and potentially dangerous. So I made a decision. I would stay inside the cabin until the storm passed, just long enough for the weather to calm down. Then I'd leave. Simple as that. At least that was the plan. I checked my watch and guessed it had probably been about an hour since I first stepped inside. Time had started to blur together with the constant roar of rain on the roof. The sound was so loud that it drowned out almost everything else, which is probably why it took me so long to notice the other noise. At first it was faint, a soft scraping sound coming from somewhere outside the cabin. I frowned and tilted my head slightly, trying to listen more carefully. For a moment I thought it might just be a branch brushing against the wall in the wind. But as I replayed the layout of the clearing in my head, I realized something that didn't make sense. I couldn't remember any branches close enough to touch the cabin. The scraping sound came again. Longer this time. Slow, deliberate, and definite. I stayed perfectly still, trying to listen through the constant roar of rain on the roof. For a few seconds, there was nothing. Just the storm. Then I heard it again. A slow, dragging sound along the outside wall of the cabin, like something moving carefully across the wooden boards. My first thought was that it had to be an animal. That would have made the most sense. A raccoon, maybe. Or a deer brushing up against the structure while trying to get out of the storm. The woods were full of animals, and during bad weather they often looked for any kind of shelter they could find. But something about the sound didn't feel right. Animals make noise when they move. Leaves crunch, branches snap. Something always gives them away. This sound was different. It was slow and controlled. Like whatever was outside was trying not to make too much noise. I found myself holding my breath without even realizing it, straining to hear anything beyond the storm. And that's when I heard it. 2 heavy thumps, right outside the door. They didn't sound like branches falling or debris hitting the cabin. They sounded deliberate, like something or someone had stepped onto the small wooden porch. My heart immediately started beating faster. I stood there, frozen in the middle of the room, staring at the door. The latch rattled slightly in the wind, but otherwise, nothing moved. For several seconds, I didn't hear anything else. Just rain pounding against the roof and the distant rumble of thunder somewhere beyond the mountains. I told myself I was overreacting. The storm was intense. Strong winds could easily throw debris around, and the sound of rain hitting the cabin could make ordinary noises seem strange. Still, the feeling just wouldn't go away. That instinctive sense that something wasn't right. My eyes drifted slowly toward the window. The glass was dark, reflecting the dim interior of the cabin. Beyond it, the forest was nothing but shifting shadows and rain. I considered walking over and looking outside, but something stopped me. A strange, uncomfortable thought crossed my mind. If someone really was standing out there in the storm, then there was a good chance they were already looking in. The idea sent a cold wave of tension through my body. So instead of moving closer to the window, I stayed exactly where I was, completely still, listening. Seconds passed, then a minute. Eventually, the fear started to fade just a little. Maybe it really had just been debris hitting the porch. Maybe the scraping sound was a loose branch somewhere nearby that I hadn't noticed earlier. I was just about to relax when something happened that instantly snapped every nerve in my body back to full alert. Pressure. On the door. Not a knock. Not scratching. Pressure. The wood creaked slightly as the door pushed inward for a moment, as if someone on the other side had leaned their full weight against it. The latch rattled once. Then, the pressure disappeared. I felt my pulse hammering in my ears. I stood there staring at the door, waiting for it to move again. But it didn't. The storm outside continued raging, rain hammering against the roof and walls like thousands of tiny drums. And then something occurred to me. A simple question that suddenly made the situation feel much worse. Why would someone stand outside in the middle of a violent thunderstorm? Instead of just coming inside? The door wasn't locked. Anyone could walk right in. Yet whoever or whatever was out there hadn't tried to open it. They had only leaned against it, testing it. And that's when my mind drifted back to the things I had noticed earlier. The bracket on the outside, the window screwed shut from the outside, the scratches on the walls. A disturbing idea slowly formed in my head. Maybe the person outside didn't want to come into the cabin. Maybe they wanted me to stay inside it. The thought hit me so suddenly that I felt my stomach drop. Up until that moment, I had been assuming the person outside, if there really was someone out there, might be another hiker. Someone who had found the cabin the same way I had. Maybe they were just checking to see if it was occupied before coming in. But the more I thought about it, the less that explanation made sense. If someone was out there in the middle of a thunderstorm, they would want shelter just as badly as I did. They wouldn't stand on the porch in the pouring rain, tapping on the walls and leaning on the door without simply opening it. Unless they didn't want to come inside. Unless the entire point was to keep me in here. My eyes drifted back to the door latch, and suddenly, the cabin felt much smaller than it had a few minutes earlier. I tried to calm myself down. My brain was probably just spiraling because of the isolation and the strange things I had noticed inside the cabin. Storms in the wilderness can play tricks on your mind. The noise, the darkness, the feeling of being completely alone, it's enough to make anyone jumpy. But the uneasy feeling in my chest refused to fade. I realized something else then. If someone was actually out there, I had no idea how long they had been watching the cabin. For all I knew, they could have seen me walk in. They could have been standing somewhere in the trees this entire time, waiting. The thought made my skin crawl. I glanced at the window again, but still couldn't bring myself to walk over and look outside. If someone really was out there, I didn't want to make eye contact with them through the glass. Instead, I quietly moved toward my backpack. Every motion felt louder than it should have in the silence of the cabin. The wooden floor creaked faintly under my boots as I crouched down and started gathering my things. At that point, I didn't care about the storm anymore. Whatever was happening outside felt far worse than a little rain and lightning. I decided I was leaving. Immediately, I shoved my jacket and gear back into my pack as quickly as I could, trying not to make too much noise. My hands were shaking slightly, which made the simple task of clipping straps together feel clumsy and slow. All the while, I kept glancing toward the door, half expecting it to suddenly burst open. Nothing happened. The storm continued pounding against the roof, masking any sound that might have been coming from outside. I was maybe 30 seconds away from slinging the pack over my shoulder and making a run for the trail when everything exploded into chaos. The sound came from behind me. Glass shattering. It happened so suddenly that I actually flinched and spun around at the same time. The cabin window burst inward as something crashed through it. For a fraction of a second, I saw a dark object flying through the air toward the center of the room. Then the entire cabin erupted in flames. Fire spread across the wooden floor and walls almost instantly, racing outward with a terrifying speed that made no sense. 1 second, the room had been dark and damp. The next, it was blazing with orange light. The heat hit me like a physical wall. I staggered backward, coughing as smoke filled the air. My brain struggled to process what had just happened. But one thing was immediately clear. Someone had thrown something burning through the window, and now the cabin was on fire. Instinct took over. I grabbed my backpack and ran for the door, yanking at the handle with all my strength. It didn't move. For a split second, I thought panic was making me clumsy. Then I pulled again. The door still wouldn't budge. A horrible realization slammed into me. The door had been secured from the outside. Whoever had thrown the burning object through the window had locked the door afterward. They were trying to trap me inside the burning cabin. Smoke poured across the ceiling as flames crawled up the walls and along the old wooden beams. The heat intensified with terrifying speed, and the air inside the cabin became thick and choking. I threw my shoulder against the door. The wood groaned but didn't give. Behind me, the fire roared louder, devouring everything it touched. I slammed into the door again. ignoring the pain that shot through my arm. This time, something cracked. The old hinges tore loose from the rotting wood, and the entire door frame splintered outward. I stumbled forward with the collapsing door and crashed onto the muddy ground outside. Cold rain immediately drenched me again, but I barely noticed. All I could think about was getting away from the fire. I scrambled to my feet and started running blindly into the forest. I didn't even know which direction the trail was anymore. Branches whipped against my face and arms as I pushed through the trees, the orange glow of the burning cabin flickering behind me through the rain. I had only made it maybe 30 or 40. The impact knocked the air out of my lungs so hard that for a moment I couldn't even breathe. Mud and rain splashed across my face as we hit the ground, and before I could even process what was happening, the person on top of me started grabbing at my throat. It was pure chaos. I couldn't see his face clearly. The rain was pouring down, the forest around us was almost completely dark, and everything was happening too fast for my brain to catch up. All I knew was that someone was trying to kill me. His hands were clawing at my neck, trying to force me onto my back. I felt his fingers digging into my skin as he tried to get a better grip around my throat. I reacted on instinct. I swung my arm upward and drove my elbow into his side as hard as I could. The movement caught him off guard, just enough for me to twist my body and shove him off balance. We both rolled across the wet ground, sliding through mud and leaves. He made a strange sound somewhere between a yell and a growl and lunged back toward me. I kicked wildly, my boot connecting with something solid. For a split second, his grip loosened. That was all I needed. I scrambled to my feet and ran. Behind me, the man screamed something that I couldn't understand, his voice echoing through the forest over the sound of rain and thunder. I didn't look back at first. I just ran. Branches tore at my clothes and face as I forced my way through the trees. My boots slipped constantly in the mud, and several times I nearly fell again. But the only thought in my head was distance. Put distance between yourself and that cabin. Between yourself and the man who had just tried to burn you alive. Eventually, panic forced me to glance over my shoulder. Through the trees, I could still see the glow of the fire. The cabin was completely engulfed in flames now, the orange light flickering violently against the rain-soaked forest. For a moment, I expected to see the man chasing me through the trees, but I couldn't see anyone. That didn't mean he wasn't there. The forest was too dark, and the rain too heavy. Someone could have been following just a few yards behind me, and I would never have known. So I kept running. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they were turning to stone, but I forced myself to keep moving until my body simply couldn't anymore. Eventually, I stumbled into a small clearing where two large fallen trees had collapsed against each other, forming a narrow, triangular space underneath. I dropped to my knees and crawled inside the gap, desperate for even the smallest amount of cover from the rain. The ground underneath was soaked, but at least the fallen trunks blocked some of the wind and water. I collapsed there, crouched between the trees, my entire body shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion. For several minutes, I couldn't do anything except breathe. Each breath came in ragged bursts as my body tried to recover from the fight and the sprint through the forest. My arms and legs ached. My throat burned where the attacker had grabbed me, and when I touched the skin, I could already feel swelling where his fingers had dug into my neck. But the worst part wasn't the pain. It was the waiting. Every few seconds, I expected to hear footsteps approaching through the rain, or to see a shadow moving between the trees. But nothing came. Just darkness. Just the storm. I don't know how long I stayed there like that. Time stopped meaning anything. Minutes felt like hours. At some point, the rain began to slow, and the distant thunder moved farther away into the mountains. Eventually, the shaking in my hands and legs started to fade just enough for me to think clearly again. And one thought became painfully obvious. I couldn't stay there forever. If the man who attacked me was still searching the forest, hiding in one place would only make it easier for him to find me. so I forced myself to move. Slowly at first, carefully pushing myself out from under the fallen trees. The forest around me was still dark and dripping with rain, but the fire from the cabin was no longer visible through the trees. Either I had run far enough away, or the flames had finally burned themselves out. I didn't stop to find out which one it was. I started walking. At first, I had no idea which direction I was going. The trail could have been anywhere, and in the darkness, every part of the forest looked exactly the same. But staying still felt worse than moving. So I kept going, step by step, pushing through the wet undergrowth and hoping that eventually I would find some kind of path. Hours seemed to pass before I finally saw something through the trees that made my heart lift for the first time since the attack. A trail. It was faint and muddy from the storm, but it was definitely a trail. I followed it without hesitation, limping slightly from exhaustion and pain. Eventually, the forest,